Hello fellow quilters, we are nearly there on our Tulips Bloom journey. In this episode we are going to look at those finishing touches of applying the binding. If you've been following me for a while, you know I do not like hand stitching. I love the thought of it, but actually doing it is a big no-no for me. So I apply my binding with the sewing machine. I'm going to show you how I cut my binding, so we're going to cut strips of 2.5 inches, how to stitch those strips together, how to prep your binding, and then actually sewing it onto the quilt. We've finished our quilting, and now I'm just going to trim up the edges of the quilt ready for binding. I've placed my ruler edge along the edge of the quilt top, and I've also made sure that one of the lines on the ruler is in line with this edge of the quilt, because what we want to do is make sure that these corners are squared up. I've trimmed my quilt, and the next thing is to get the binding cut. I've decided to go with this lovely bright green as the binding. So our next stage is to get this cut into 2.5 inch strips. So I've worked out for this quilt I will need 6 strips for the binding at 2.5 inches. I've got my strips of fabric here. I'm just going to show you how I make my binding. So many different ways. You need to find the right one for you. Now, as I'm using a plain fabric, it doesn't really matter which way it goes, but normally this would be face up, and if this is a patterned one, this will be face down, because we're going to sew diagonally across there, and then when we pull that back we'll have part of our binding. Now you can eyeball this, or you can, just going to turn this around, make a mark with your friction pen or whatever pens you like to use. I'm trying to get this in the right place and not knock the camera. I'm going to move my needle to the middle. It's in the centre. I'm going to reduce my stitch length to 2 mil. That's the first part. So I've got 6 of these to sew together, and then when I'm done, let me just get my scissors. When I've done sewing them all together, I just cut across here, trim those little dog ears off. And we've got our binding. I've pieced together all of my binding now, and we're going to press it inwards, so the seams are going to sit on the inside. But first, this is what I do. I get this corner and I fold it inwards, and I just press that in place. So this is going to be the start of our binding. And then I'm going to pull that across, and I'm going to press this. I'm going to do this for the whole of the binding. My binding's all ready. I've got my label. The next thing is to start binding. We're going to attach the binding to the back of the quilt, and I'm just unravelling a little bit of the binding. I'm placing the raw edges of the binding against the raw edges of the quilt. And here you can see the corner that we pressed at a 45-degree angle. I've opened up the binding and I'm just going to sew down this edge by about 2 inches. Once that's secured in place, I'm going to fold the rest of the binding back over. I'm not going to start sewing at the top of that fold line. I'm going to start sewing about 1.5 inches down. And that's because when we get all the way around the quilt, we're going to tuck the other end of the binding into that gap there. I'm using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And now I'm going to sew all the way down, attaching the binding to the quilt. Towards the edge of the quilt now. And I'm not going to sew right up to the edge. I'm going to leave about 1/4 inch. Secure those stitches in place. You might have a back stitch. I'm going to turn this around. And the quilt's quite heavy, and then we're going to fold this like so, and this will create the mitered corner on the other side. So can you see? Make sure everything's in line, so this is straight, these 2 edges are together, it's straight across there and down the side as well. And I like to just put a little sewing clip just to keep that in place, so I'm not having to wiggle it once I get it back under the sewing foot. Secure your stitches and then keep carrying on to the next corner. We are on the last stretch now of the binding to the back of the quilt. You see we are coming up towards this section here. So I'm just going to grab my scissors, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut this at an angle. A bit awkward, but let's just sew a little bit more. So I'm just going to sew that there, and then I'm going to tuck that in. Make sure that everything lines up. Right. And we're now ready to sew it onto the other side. So I'll remove these little clips and we'll turn that over and we'll get ready for sewing it down. This is the edge that we tucked the binding into. I'm now going to clip. I always start sewing around about here to make sure that that all gets secured first. And again, I'm using my sewing clips. Now I'm going to move my needle over right to the left hand side, and I'm going to use a stitch length of 3. There is black thread in the bobbin, so you won't see any of the stitches on the other side. This time I'm going to pull my thread up to the top. I'm going to secure that stitch in place. This is a little bit bumpy over here because you've got a lot of layers. So So just take your time. So I get to this stage and I like to just clip the other edge. But I also want to sort out my mitered corner. So I'm just going to make sure that's folded down there. And I like to put a little clip, sewing clip on there. Hold it down, watch your fingers. Leave the needle in and gently turn your quilt, because don't forget it's really heavy at this stage. I'll just keep adding my clips to the binding as I go. You do that for every corner. I like to add a label into my quilts, and I normally do this at the right hand corner, bottom corner. But it doesn't really matter on this quilt because you could put it anywhere. So I've just folded it in half, tucked it inside the binding. I'm just going to stitch over it. It's as easy as that. We are on the homeward stretch now, so we're nearly back to where we started. I'm just going to trim these threads, and I'm just going to overlap those stitches a little. Secure the stitch in place or do a back stitch. And we have our finished binding. Fantastic! I am so happy with how this quilt has turned out. I hope that you've enjoyed this series. I've enjoyed making it. However, it has taken me 4 times as long to make this quilt. I would like to say thank you again for following me on my very first series on YouTube, the Tulips Bloom Quilt. So if you have enjoyed this series, please press the like and subscribe button and let me know in the comments below. Thanks again.